There are moments in history when nations face crossroads, when decisions that seem small today shape the fate of generations. Today, I want to talk to you about something most people ignore until it's too late: the national debt, not as a political argument, but as a systemic risk, a ticking time bomb, and how, if left unchecked, it could bankrupt America, not just financially, but structurally. Throughout history, there has been a recurring pattern that governs the rise and fall of nations. This pattern is not ideological, it's structural. It's not confined to democracies or autocracies, left-wing governments or right-wing governments. It is rooted in the most basic principles of economics, human nature, and governance. And one of the clearest, most consistent signals in that pattern is the accumulation of unsustainable debt. Empires tend to rise when they are productive, competitive, and unified. They build strong education systems, innovate, invest in infrastructure, and create environments of opportunity. This leads to prosperity, which increases national income and global influence. In this phase, debt is often used productively to build things that generate more income than they cost. But as prosperity grows, so does complacency. Success breeds overconfidence. Spending increases, often outpacing productivity. Governments begin to take on more debt, not to invest, but to maintain standards of living, fund entitlements, and mask the symptoms of economic inefficiencies. Over time, the debt becomes less about creating value and more about postponing pain. That's when the cycle turns. You can see this dynamic clearly in the fall of major historical powers. The Dutch Empire, for example, dominated global trade in the 17th century. They had the world's first central bank, a thriving financial system, and military superiority. But as they overextended, militarily and financially, the cost of maintaining the empire outpaced the wealth it was generating. Debt exploded, trust in Dutch bonds declined, the currency weakened. Eventually, they lost their status as the world's leading economic power. The British Empire followed a similar path. At its height, Britain controlled more than a quarter of the world's land and population. But the cost of 2 world wars, along with generous social spending programs and colonial maintenance, forced the government into massive borrowing. The pound sterling, once the world's reserve currency, saw its dominance wane. Confidence in the currency eroded, and the burden of debt eventually became unmanageable. The British Empire didn't fall in a day, it declined gradually, as the financial underpinnings that supported its dominance crumbled. This isn't about placing blame on any one country or decision. It's about recognizing that this is a structural phenomenon, a natural progression that happens when debt grows faster than income, when spending is sustained not by productivity but by borrowing. What makes this cycle so dangerous is that it's often invisible to most people until the very end. In the beginning, rising debt feels good. It creates a sense of abundance. Living standards are propped up. Markets rise. Politicians are rewarded for short-term fixes. There's little resistance, because everyone benefits, or so it seems. But underneath that surface lies fragility. The more debt a nation accumulates, the more it becomes dependent on low interest rates and external financing. If those conditions change, if rates rise or creditors lose faith, the cost of servicing the debt balloons. That forces the government into difficult choices: raise taxes, cut spending, or print more money. None of those choices are painless. All have consequences. The printing option, monetary inflation, is usually the path of least resistance. It's politically easier to erode the value of money quietly than to raise taxes overtly or slash programs that people rely on. But printing leads to inflation, And inflation is a silent tax on savers, wage earners, and the poor. It redistributes wealth, increases inequality, and undermines confidence in the currency. When enough people lose faith in the value of money, when they begin to expect inflation as a norm, they change their behavior. They spend faster, invest defensively, and protect themselves. That in turn accelerates the inflation cycle until it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's when stability breaks. That's when debt becomes unpayable, not because the numbers don't add up, but because the entire foundation of trust collapses. The United States today is showing signs of entering this later phase of the cycle. Debt is exploding, productivity growth is stagnating, and the political system is increasingly polarized. Trust in institutions, in leadership, in the dollar is weakening, and the lessons of history are there in plain sight. We've seen this movie before, multiple times, in different languages, with different actors, but always with the same ending, ignoring that history doesn't make us immune to it. Understanding it doesn't guarantee a better outcome, but it gives us a chance to course correct before the tipping point is behind us, because once you lose control of the debt cycle, once it turns from a tool into a trap, it's incredibly hard to recover without significant economic and social pain. The pattern is clear. The question is whether we'll learn from it or repeat it. A debt spiral is one of the most dangerous economic phenomena a nation can face because it develops gradually, is sustained by short-term incentives, and culminates in long-term consequences that are often irreversible without immense cost. It begins with good intentions, stimulating growth, managing downturns, supporting programs, but over time, the arithmetic of compounding debt becomes a force of its own, and it starts to control the system rather than being controlled by it. At the root of the spiral is a simple imbalance. The government spends more than it takes in. To cover the gap, it borrows. As the debt grows, so do the interest payments, and that's where the compounding effect takes hold. Each year, a larger share of government revenue is used just to pay interest on the existing debt. That means even if spending remains flat, and even if taxes are raised modestly, the cost of the debt itself continues to grow. The system becomes structurally dependent on borrowing more just to service the debt it already has. It's not hard to see how this becomes a feedback loop. Borrowing leads to higher debt. Higher debt leads to higher interest payments. Higher interest payments increase the deficit, and to cover the growing deficit, the government borrows even more. This is the spiral, and once a nation enters this phase, the options for a soft landing start to vanish. For a time, markets may tolerate this behavior. Investors will continue to buy government bonds, especially if the country has a reputation for stability or if its currency is widely held. But this tolerance isn't unlimited. There's always a threshold, sometimes visible, often invisible, at which confidence begins to break down. It may begin subtly, with investors demanding slightly higher yields to compensate for rising risk. Then it accelerates, the bond market becomes volatile, the cost of borrowing spikes. Suddenly, debt servicing takes up a significant portion of GDP, and at that point, policymakers are trapped. They can't raise interest rates without increasing debt costs dramatically. They can't cut spending without triggering economic contraction or social unrest. They can't raise taxes enough without harming competitiveness or pushing capital out of the country. The math simply doesn't work. The remaining option is the one most governments resort to: printing money. Central banks step in to buy bonds and inject liquidity. In the short run, this seems like a relief. Interest rates come down. Markets stabilize, but this solution is not without cost. Injecting large amounts of money into the system dilutes the value of the currency. If done moderately, it can be absorbed. But if done persistently, it leads to inflation. And when inflation takes hold, the spiral enters a more dangerous stage. As inflation rises, bondholders demand even higher yields to compensate for the eroding value of their returns. That means more borrowing at higher costs, which forces more money printing, which fuels more inflation. The government is now borrowing and printing not to stimulate growth, but simply to survive, to keep the machine running. It is the economic equivalent of burning the furniture to stay warm. What's important to understand is that this spiral is not just about economics. It affects everything. Inflation hurts real wages, devalues savings, and disproportionately impacts lower and middle-income households. It undermines trust in institutions and in the financial system itself. It widens wealth gaps and intensifies political polarization. People begin to look for someone to blame: foreigners, the wealthy, political elites, the other side. Social cohesion breaks down. In these environments, populism and extremism often thrive. History is filled with examples of nations that have entered debt spirals and failed to escape them without major crises, monetary resets, social upheaval, political transformations. Once the spiral begins, reversing it requires either immense political will, often not present in democracies, or a shock so severe that the system resets involuntarily. The U.S. is approaching a critical point. Debt has reached levels where the interest burden is already one of the largest government expenses, even at relatively low rates. If interest rates return to historical norms, or worse, if investors demand a premium for holding U.S. debt, the cost curve steepens sharply. Add to that rising entitlement costs, political gridlock, and declining productivity growth, and the ingredients of a full-blown debt spiral are already present. Avoiding the spiral, or escaping it once it begins, requires difficult choices. It means restoring fiscal discipline, rethinking long-term obligations, investing in productivity, enhancing reforms, and rebuilding trust in the value of the currency. These are not popular moves, but the alternative. Continuing the cycle of borrowing, printing, and inflating isn't sustainable. Eventually, the spiral tightens, and when it does, it no longer matters what anyone wants to do. The system starts making the decisions for them. Confidence in a currency, particularly one that serves as the world's reserve, is built over decades, but can be lost in a matter of years, sometimes faster. It's not determined solely by interest rates or inflation metrics, but by the collective belief of individuals, institutions, and nations in the long-term reliability and integrity of that currency. When that belief erodes, the consequences are profound, not just economically, but geopolitically, socially, and structurally. The dollar's role as the dominant global currency has allowed the United States to operate under a different set of rules than the rest of the world. It has enabled the U.S. to borrow at scale, run persistent deficits, and engage in foreign interventions and domestic spending programs that would not be feasible for other nations. The world's demand for dollars has created a structural support system, a cushion that has protected the U.S. from the typical feedback loops that punish over-indebted economies, but that cushion is not indestructible. It relies on trust that the U.S. will manage its finances responsibly, trust that the currency will maintain its value over time, trust that the political system will produce sound economic outcomes, and trust that, in times of crisis, the institutions tasked with maintaining stability will act in the interest of long-term sustainability. That trust is now being tested. Decades of rising debt, loose monetary policy, and political gridlock have created mounting doubts. The massive expansion of the money supply during periods of crisis, while understandable in the short term, has not been matched with corresponding increases in productivity or fiscal discipline. Instead, the response has often been to print more, borrow more, and hope that the momentum carries forward. But hope is not a strategy, and the rest of the world is watching closely. When foreign nations hold trillions of dollars in reserves, they are making a bet, not just on the U.S. economy, but on its governance, its discipline, and its trajectory. If that bet begins to look less certain, diversification becomes not just prudent, but necessary, and that's exactly what's happening. Central banks around the world are incrementally reducing their dollar exposure, seeking alternatives in gold, other currencies, and non-dollar denominated assets. These moves are not headline grabbing, but they are telling. It's not just about reserves either, it's about trade. More bilateral trade agreements are being settled in currencies other than the dollar. Major economies are building infrastructure that bypasses the dollar-based system entirely. As these systems mature, they will reduce the world's dependence on the dollar, and with it, the automatic demand that has underpinned America's borrowing capacity for decades. What makes this shift especially dangerous is that it can feed on itself. If confidence in the dollar declines, investors demand higher yields to compensate for perceived risk. That raises the cost of borrowing. Higher borrowing costs increase deficits, which in turn raises the need for more issuance. If foreign demand isn't there, the central bank is left as the buyer of last resort. That means more money printing, and more money printing, especially when disconnected from productivity growth, leads to inflation. Inflation undermines confidence further, and so the cycle tightens. This isn't speculative, it's a mechanical sequence rooted in history and repeated many times. Once a country's debt grows too large relative to income, and once that debt starts being monetized rather than financed by productive investment, the decline of the currency is just a matter of time, unless drastic corrective actions are taken. The U.S. still has advantages. Its economy remains dynamic. Its institutions, though weakened, still function. Its capital markets are deep and liquid, but these strengths are not infinite. If they are overused, taken for granted, or exploited for short-term gain, they will erode. And once the world loses confidence in the dollar, the privilege that comes with being the issuer of the world's reserve currency disappears, along with the benefits it provides. At that point, the consequences are severe. Import costs rise, domestic inflation accelerates, capital flees, living standards fall, the government becomes more reliant on internal debt monetization, which leads to even higher inflation. Social unrest follows as real wages decline and savings are devalued. And politically, the environment becomes more unstable as leaders struggle to manage the fallout while preserving legitimacy. The loss of confidence in a currency is not just a financial event, it is a societal event. It signals a turning point, a shift from trust to doubt, from stability to uncertainty, and once it happens, regaining that confidence is far more difficult than maintaining it in the first place. History teaches that clearly. The question is whether that lesson will be heeded before it's too late. When wealth gaps grow too large, they become more than just economic imbalances. They become existential threats to the stability of a society. It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about how people feel when they look around and see a system that seems to benefit a few while leaving many behind. That perception, over time, fuels resentment, erodes trust, and sets the stage for serious conflict. Throughout history, rising inequality has been one of the most reliable indicators of societal stress. It starts slowly. In times of expansion, those with capital, the wealthy, tend to see their wealth grow faster than those who live off wages. Investments compound, real estate appreciates, businesses expand, and those gains become self-reinforcing. When money makes more money, the advantage grows exponentially. Meanwhile, wage earners often see incremental gains at best, especially if inflation eats into their purchasing power. The gap widens. In recent decades, this has played out in a significant way. The top fraction of the population now holds more wealth than the vast majority combined. The bottom 60%, in many cases, are living paycheck to paycheck. They have limited access to quality education, health care, and upward mobility. That alone creates frustration. But the real problem begins when people start to believe that the system is rigged, that the rules are written by and for those at the top. Once that belief takes hold, institutions lose credibility. People no longer trust that working hard will improve their lives. They begin to disengage or, worse, rebel. Historically, when this kind of discontent builds, it leads to internal conflict. You see the rise of populism, nationalism, extremism. People want change, and they're willing to support anyone who promises to break the system, even if that means breaking it apart. Inequality in and of itself is not new. What matters is how it's managed. In times of high inequality, governments have historically responded in one of two ways, either by redistributing wealth through taxation and social programs, or by ignoring the issue and allowing tensions to escalate. When the latter happens, the result is almost always disorder, sometimes peaceful protests, sometimes violent revolution, but always some form of reckoning. Now, combine this with high debt levels and economic stagnation, and you get a combustible mix. As governments try to fund their obligations, entitlements, healthcare, interest payments, they often turn to monetary policy, printing money to cover deficits. In the short term, this can relieve pressure. But in the long term, it drives up asset prices, which disproportionately benefits those who already hold financial assets. Stocks go up, real estate goes up, and the wealth gap widens further. Meanwhile, the cost of living increases, but wages don't keep pace. Essentials like housing, health care, and education become more expensive. The middle class shrinks. The working class struggles. And those at the top, who are benefiting from financial markets and global capital flows, become increasingly detached from the everyday realities of the rest of the population. This divergence creates what you could call two economies, one for the asset-rich and one for everyone else. And when those two economies diverge too far, they cease to function as one society. Dialogue breaks down. Political compromise becomes impossible. Everyone retreats into their corners, blaming the other side. It's not a left versus right issue anymore. It's top versus bottom. And history shows that when those conditions persist, you eventually get conflict. Often informs people don't see coming until they're in the middle of it. We're already seeing signs of this. Polarization is at historic highs. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. Younger generations no longer believe they'll be better off than their parents. That breaks a critical part of the social contract, the belief that each generation will have a shot at a better life. Once that belief is lost, faith in the system goes with it. And that's where the danger lies. Because when faith in the system erodes, people stop playing by the rules. They look for alternatives. Sometimes those alternatives are productive. More often, they're destructive. If these gaps aren't addressed thoughtfully, if they're not narrowed through policies that promote shared prosperity, the system risks breaking, not all at once and not everywhere, but gradually, then suddenly. It's happened before, and unless the underlying causes are understood and addressed, it can happen again. Long-term debt cycles don't end quietly. They build slowly, fueled by decades of credit expansion, monetary accommodation, and rising asset prices. But eventually, the limits are reached. The mechanics of the system break down, and when that moment arrives, the economic environment doesn't just correct, it transforms. Every long-term debt cycle begins with a period of productivity, growth, and innovation. Credit is used to invest in things that generate real returns, new industries, infrastructure, technology. Debt levels rise, but the income and productivity gains outpace the cost of that debt. Society thrives. Standards of living improve. Trust in the system builds, but over time, the behavior shifts. As memories of past downturns fade, the constraints around debt issuance loosen. Credit becomes cheaper and more available. Policymakers step in more aggressively to smooth over downturns, injecting liquidity and suppressing interest rates. The market learns to expect intervention. Risk is no longer priced accurately. Borrowing expands, not just for productive uses, but for consumption, speculation, and political expedience. Asset prices inflate, wealth concentrates, and the debt burden quietly compounds. This process can continue for decades. The system becomes increasingly fragile, even as it appears stable. But beneath the surface, debts accumulate faster than incomes. Promises are made, entitlements, pensions, guarantees that are easier to legislate than to fund. At first, the shortfalls are manageable. Later, they are monetized. And finally, they become too large to hide. That's when the end of the cycle begins, not with a bang, but with a series of decisions that reveal the system's constraints. Central banks hit the lower bound on interest rates. Fiscal authorities find themselves with shrinking room to maneuver. Debt service costs consume a rising share of revenues, growth slows, and confidence, always the invisible foundation, starts to crack. When that happens, the usual tools stop working. Rate cuts lose their power. Printing money no longer stimulates growth. It simply inflates prices. Asset purchases prop up markets but do little for the real economy. The benefits of intervention accrue to those closest to the financial system, widening the gap between asset owners and wage earners. Social tensions mount, populism rises, polarization deepens. At the same time, the currency begins to weaken. Investors, foreign governments, and citizens themselves start to question the long-term value of holding cash or bonds that yield less than inflation. They seek alternatives, real assets, hard currencies, anything that holds value over time. This capital flight accelerates the decline in purchasing power. The country becomes trapped in a cycle, more debt, more printing, more inflation. The end of the long-term debt cycle always involves some form of reset. There are only a few ways it can happen. One is a deflationary collapse, where defaults wipe out debts but also destroy wealth and employment. Another is inflationary default, where money is printed to pay the debt nominally, but the real value is eroded. Occasionally, a country manages to grow its way out, but that requires a level of productivity gain, demographic support, and political consensus that is rarely present at the end of a cycle. In most historical cases, the reset is inflationary. It's politically easier. It doesn't require asking voters to accept defaults or cuts. It allows debts to be paid with devalued money, but the cost is real. It punishes savers. It redistributes wealth arbitrarily. It undermines trust in institutions, and it creates conditions where the social fabric begins to tear. Eventually, the system exhausts itself. The money that once provided stability becomes a source of instability. People no longer want to hold it. Foreigners sell it. Domestic holders rush to convert it. Central banks lose credibility. Markets lose anchor, and the country faces a choice: rebuild the system from the ground up or face prolonged dysfunction. This is the point where leadership matters most. If the problems are recognized early, painful but constructive reforms can still be made. Entitlements can be recalibrated. Budgets can be disciplined. Investment in productivity can be prioritized. Trust can be restored. But if those choices are deferred, if politics dominates economics, the end of the cycle will be shaped not by policy, but by necessity. History is clear. The end of a long-term debt cycle is not the end of the world, but it is the end of an era. It marks the transition from one paradigm to another. The way money works, the way policy is conducted, the way markets behave, all of it shifts. And those who understand that shift, who see it coming, are the ones best positioned not only to protect themselves, but to help shape what comes next. So what do? We start by understanding, by seeing the machine for what it is, not an ideology, not a red or blue issue, but a cycle, a pattern, a reality, and then we ask, how close are we to the tipping point? If we don't correct course, if we continue to spend without discipline, print without consequence, and ignore the lessons of history, we won't need an enemy to bring us down. We'll do it to ourselves, and the next generation will look back and wonder why no one saw it coming, but we did see it. And the question is, what will we do about it?